Rupert Sheldrake is a British parapsychological researcher. He found that dogs telepathically know when their owners are coming home. He examined more than 1,000 cases in which a dog would anticipate their owner's return and wait by the door or window. But wait, isn't that normal? How do we know they can read minds? With one dog, they filmed it. In 100 tests, the results were statistically significant. So Sheldrake upped the stakes. The next 12 times Sheldrake had the owner go out, and at randomly selected times, he would call her on the telephone to tell her that she could head home. She'd go by taxi or an unfamiliar vehicle to rule out that the dog just recognized familiar sounds or routines. Now check this out. Not only did her dog, JT, get up and wait by the window at these random times, but it happened pretty much exactly when the owner got the phone call and made the decision to head home. A TV crew came all the way from Austria to get these experiments on video and confirm everything I just mentioned. Then a psychologist skeptic came to confirm it too, and he got the same results when he did 4 of his own experiments. JT went to the window just 4% of the time when she wasn't coming home and was at the window 78% of the time when she was. Your dog can read your mind, and animal telepathy is real. Join me, Rob Counts, for a metaphysical show that's out of this world. How do I know dogs can read your mind? I read hundreds of pages of CIA documents, modern research experiments, and secret Soviet operations that prove it. But first, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the Metaphysical channel to make sure you don't miss out on any updates or content drops. All your support means that we can keep making more content, so thanks a lot for wearing our Metaphysical merch, for drinking our Metaphysical coffee, and for watching. You guys are awesome. Now, would you believe that from as far back as 1920 through the peak of the Cold War and the 60s up to the 90s and even till today, animal telepathy experiments have continued? From dogs that can read their owner's mind to clever circus animals who did things that should have been impossible, to secret military experiments on innocent bunny rabbits. It's clear something deeper is going on with man's best friend. If you thought animal testing was just for cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, think again, because there's a whole wide world of parapsychology you've been kept in the dark about that could clue us into more about our own human bodies. How does a dog almost instantaneously know when his owner is planning on coming home? No matter how far away JT's owner traveled, the mental communication wasn't affected. Unfortunately, the psychologist skeptic who confirmed Sheldrake's same results when he ran 4 of his own experiments turned around and falsely claimed that he'd proven it was coincidence. He even implied with footage that JT was just continually going to the window. But the footage they used actually showed an instance when his owner was coming home and another when some dogs were walking by outside, and of course a dog's gonna go check that out. You know what's super frustrating? Multiple media outlets ran with the claim that the skeptic had debunked the story, but Sheldrake's research is available online and it's pretty airtight. He was also able to replicate it with a different woman and her 7 dogs in 1996. In 5 out of 7 tests, the dogs reacted to her thoughts when she was thinking of walking them. A different scientist in 1997 conducted dog telepathy experiments that went so well, an employee anonymously went to the newspaper to complain. He said it was so boring to stare at dogs for 7 hours a day that the telepathic dogs were picking up on his boredom and melancholy. They were so tuned in that they were starting to get depressed too. Get this, I actually found accounts of this dog telepathy phenomenon as far back as 1928. One newspaper reported that a British Army officer knew a telepathic dog who always went to the railway station to meet his owner, regardless of the irregular intervals when these journeys were made. If the owner missed a train, amazingly, the dog would somehow know to meet the proper one. All this got me thinking. I mean, there's plenty of other evidence that animal telepathy is real, so what would be the benefit of people thinking there's no truth to it, like when a bunch of newspapers debunk it based on false claims? Well, for one, it would make it a heck of a lot easier for governmental projects to conduct more sensitive telepathy experiments if everyone is just convinced that the phenomenon doesn't exist, wouldn't it? You can bet the militaries of the world were extremely interested in studying mental communication, and what their secret projects found was astounding. So let's dive into the Soviet research next. I can't tell you how many documents I've read on Soviet parapsychology experiments, but I want to point out certain ones that are important to this animal telepathy deep dive that we're doing. First, I found documentation from the CIA that parapsychological research was being conducted in the USSR between the 1917 October Revolution and the mid-1950s, and maybe even earlier. Well, there were two very important men researching this, Vladimir Bekhterev and Bernard Kaczynski. Bekhterev was a neurologist and psychologist who was up there with people like Pavlov, although he had a lot of criticisms for Pavlov's classical conditioning experiments. Now, while Bekhterev was influential and well-known in the USSR then, what was lesser known were his experiments in the 1920s and 1930s at Leningrad University on mental communication between dogs and humans. Bekhterev and a few years later, Kaczynski individually teamed up with an animal trainer with the circus named Vladimir Durov. Now get this, Durov had become known for his ability to communicate mentally with the circus dogs. At first, the Soviet telepathy tests were just to see if the phenomenon worked, but Durov and Kaczynski conducted almost 1,300 experiments, and some of them were complicated, like dogs solving arithmetic problems or retrieving objects they'd been mentally asked to get. I mean, sorry, what the heck? I just keep seeing a dog solving math problems at a chalkboard between feedings and farts. I mean, that's cool, like really freaking cool, but why were the researchers really interested in this? Bekhterev initially wanted to prove that telepathy between humans and animals was mediated by some form of electromagnetic radiation, or EMR. But by 1937, it was clear to all the Soviet scientists that there was no known form of EMR that carried thought transmission. And if you think this is just about animals, this even worked human to human. Kaczynski asked Durov to try to get him to do a wordless command. Now listen to this. Durov wrote something down, they locked eyes, and then suddenly Kaczynski was compelled to scratch behind his right ear. Written on the paper was that exact command. I mean, how did this work? In 1962, Kaczynski thought maybe the animal's nervous system was involved, and that there was some focused concentration of biological energy by the brain. For decades after, the Soviets and Czech scientists tried looking for the source of this biological energy and how it interacts with external fields. But even by 1975, it was obvious that some supposed potential energy in the brain couldn't actually explain this amazing phenomenon. Now, here's some amazing info I have to get out before I move on from these guys. Shockingly, Bekhterev was probably murdered by Stalin. He'd been asked to give him a health exam, told the truth, and he gave Stalin a diagnosis of paranoia and a short, dry hand, which obviously would be politically damaging to a commie, psychotic Soviet dictator. A day later, Bekhterev mysteriously died at 70 years old with no former health problems. Gee whiz. For such a smart guy, you'd think Bekhterev knew who he was dealing with. Now, I want to know, though, was it just Stalin's reputation that was being protected here, or also parapsychological research? Back to Kaczynski, he reportedly published a book in Moscow in 1923. I couldn't find that one, but I did find this book that appears to have been published in 1950 on free-flow hydroelectric power stations and radio communications technology. Kaczynski was a communications expert even with power plant technology. So what do you think he discovered for the Soviets about mental communications too? And where did that research go? When it comes to governments, militaries, and secret projects, the point of animal parapsychological research is to use it for human applications and weapons. So let's talk about the most insane wartime uses of this animal telepathy research that you've probably never heard before. In the 1960s, the Soviets took a mother rabbit who'd just given birth and implanted electrodes deep inside her brain. She was kept on shore while her newborn babies were taken out to sea in a submarine. The Soviets saw that each synchronized time when they intentionally butchered a baby rabbit, because they're Soviets and they sucked, there was a sharp reaction in the mother rabbit's brain that was recorded by the electrodes. Somehow, communication had taken place between the rabbit and the stolen babies across space and time. I told this story in my episode on telepathy and mind reading that got into plants, animals, babies, and other wartime Soviet experiments. I do like to focus on the positive, but these things did happen and they're very relevant here because of the distance involved. Let me explain, because it gets pretty deep. But think about how far it is from a submarine to land. Even if they're not that far out, there are still many feet or miles, metal walls, and water to pass thoughts through. Radio signals, for instance, can't pass through water. But thoughts somehow can? It seemed like distance wasn't always a factor in mental telepathy with animals. In 1963, the CIA saved a report of the names and locations where parapsychology was being conducted in the USSR. The Durov Institute, the Pavlovian Institute, and most interesting of all here, the Bekhterev Brain Institute were doing telepathic communications experiments with animals and probably also humans. But I say Bekterev's was most interesting because his did long-distance telepathy experiments over 1,200 miles. Think about how far that is. That's halfway along the Mississippi River. That's more than 3 million corgis across. In 1983, another distance telepathy experiment was conducted with rats. Two groups of caged rats in the USSR were housed a mile apart. Each group learned to move to the left side of their cage when a red light was turned on to avoid an electric shock to their feet. Then, they tried randomly choosing a single rat at a time to signal and shock. Amazingly, in the other distant cage, the shocked rat's brother, if he was from the same litter, would also move to the left side of his own cage. How did he know the brother was in trouble a mile away? A similar experiment had been conducted with humans a few years earlier, which is pretty horrifying. Now, they too tested shocking people electrically. So they had what they called a sender, or this person sending the thoughts. He was imagining he was choking or bludgeoning a receiving person, the person on the receiving end of this, okay? Now, this was usually a friend of the guy sending the thoughts. Then the receiver was monitored to see if he had any negative psychological effects. That's pretty weird. Who would do these terrible experiments? Experimenters also repeatedly were able to psychically raise burns on the arms of volunteer observers. Of course, I want to know if these were really volunteers or just prisoners of war, because hey, we're dealing with commies here. But after they learned friends could affect each other physically, and dogs who liked their owners could pick up on their thoughts, and scientists familiar with their dictator overlord Stalin could intuit information about them, the next step was psychic weaponization. Now, telekinesis is something I'll hit in another episode because I found a lot on that as well. But if distance isn't necessarily a factor, and it's not limited to just dogs or rats, what other animals could be used for the war effort? In 1970, a Soviet researcher was working on bionics, information transmission, dolphins, animals, and telepathy. Over in America, they took that kind of research further and trained dolphins to be CIA spies. No joke. I'll do a whole episode on telepathy experiments in the West too, don't worry. Perhaps the most famous parapsychology experiments that were done in the West, though, were the ones that went into the Stargate project between 1977 and 1990. It was known by other names like Project Sunstreak and investigated psychic phenomena under collaboration between the US Army and Defense Intelligence Agency and the Stanford Research Institute. Why is SRI behind everything? In fact, there was so much information that was studied that on Halloween night, 1990, designs for a bibliographic database were ordered to be created. With a database, people internal to the project could receive information about books, articles, papers, and more on subjects related to Sunstreak. The first category of subject matter that had been tracked alphabetically was animal ESP. Now, some of you might be asking, well, Rob, what do you think about all this? Well, I think that governments will weaponize just about anything to get an edge in the international competition of war. It's pretty clear that telepathy is not only possible, but also definitely happening between pets and their owners, or animals and people they become familiar with. What's interesting to me is what happened with the rats in the cages a mile apart, where a rat could tell when his brother was shocked. Those experiments only worked when individual rats were being studied. The experiments were not successful when they were carried out with both groups of rats, and the reason was because they fought with each other under stressful conditions. So, if telepathy is happening in humans too, what happens when we're constantly in stressful conditions? Do our telepathic abilities also suffer, and that's why we don't see it happening to everyone all the time? What happens when those external stressful conditions are created artificially or deliberately by a government, multiple governments, or powers that would love to control people of another nation? I'd wager that we'd probably start acting like rats in a cage too, and start fighting each other without even knowing why. Some people hear that their dog or cat can read their mind, or that other animals seem to have this ability, and they start thinking that, hey, maybe animals are better than humans. I think the evidence has shown, though, that animals just have innate instincts like this. Their intellect isn't like humans, and they can't think with our quality of thought. Telepathy may just be natural. Ask any animal trainer and you'll hear that in general, dogs like to work and like to protect people, and that seems to be their inborn role. So if we realize our own power and became perhaps less stressed and complicated and owned our own inborn abilities to do what the animals can do but more, think what humans would accomplish. What would our civilization look like? I think the governments who've been researching this for decades know. And I think we're beginning to know too. For me, I'm going to keep sharing what I found in my research because if we can hack our own minds and bodies and raise ourselves up, then maybe telepathy is just the tip of the iceberg. But what do you think? Have you experienced telepathy with your pet, with a friend, or with someone else? Let me know in the comments because your stories are pretty freaking awesome and they really keep us going. If you like this episode and you want more, you can support my work by pledging on our website, themetaphysical.tv. With your help, I can make more free content, plus more merch, which I designed myself, and also more of our longer, conversational, exclusive episodes you can access at themetaphysical.tv. Like episodes on mad scientist experimentation, the observer effect, a special director's cut of Nikola Tesla made a death ray and the government stole it, and what happened to scientists who dared to talk about anti-gravity. You can also get a bag of delicious metaphysical coffee every month if you want your mornings to be interstellar. Remember to like and subscribe to help the channel grow as well. And with that, I hope you thought this episode was out of this world.